Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the Linglobe channel. This time, we'll be bringing you content about preserving the world's languages for the future. Please enjoy it to the end.
Imagine fighting a war against the mighty Spanish Empire for hundreds of years and actually winning.
Yeah, which is just unheard of.
Totally. And not because you had like a massive centralized army, an all-powerful king, or towering walls of stone, but precisely because you didn't have any of those things. Welcome to Linglobe Voice. Today, we are walking you through the fascinating Linglobe materials that explore South America's largest indigenous group.
Right, and when we sit down to learn about ancient cultures, we are usually, conditioned to expect a story told in the past tense. We expect to look at ruins.
Exactly. Dust off some old pottery or something.
Yeah, but the most important thing to know right out of the gate is that this is not a story about the past. We are talking about a living, breathing worldview here.
Which we see the foundation of right away when we look at the first slide, titled Mapuche People of the Land.
Yeah, that framing is just so crucial to keep in mind. When we review this opening slide, placing us in the breathtaking ancient landscapes of what is now Chile and Argentina, we aren't just looking at geography, We are looking at an enduring spirit. The Mapuche possess a culture and a language that are very much alive today, and their name actually gives us the key to their entire philosophy.
Because Mapu means land, and Shi means people.
Exactly. They are literally the people of the land. It's an identity entirely anchored to the physical earth beneath their feet.
But, to understand how they achieve such incredible endurance, we really have to look at how they organize themselves long before European ships ever arrived.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the slide titled The Ancestral Territory.
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting.
It really does. The materials note that they established thriving communities in the southern Andes, deeply intertwined with nature and heavily reliant on agriculture and livestock. But, how did they manage this without building the massive centralized cities we usually associate with empires?
Well, that structural contrast is really the key to understanding them. In pre-Columbian South America, the default assumption is always the Inca Empire, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Massive stone cities, an emperor collecting tribute, a rigid top-down hierarchy.
Exactly. But the Mapuche completely rejected that imperial model. They structured their lives around collective local communities, which were essentially extended family groups.
Wait, so there was no singular ruler making unilateral decisions for everyone?
None at all. Their strength was entirely horizontal.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was a network of local leaders collaborating when necessary, but maintaining strict local independence on a daily basis.
It reminds me less of an ancient kingdom and more of like a modern Wi-Fi mesh network.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Because if you have a traditional network with one central router, say, the Inca Emperor, and an invading army unplugs that router, the whole empire goes offline. The entire system just collapses.
Right.
But a mesh network has dozens of equal self-sustaining nodes. If one node goes down, the signal just instantly routes around it and keeps the system online.
That is an incredibly useful way to visualize it, for sure. It allowed for individual autonomy, but, massive collective resilience when they were actually threatened.
And the primary way they maintained the bonds of that decentralized network was through a language just as unique as their social structure. Let's examine this slide titled, A Linguistic Island, Mapudungun.
Yeah, linguistically speaking, Mapudungun is considered an absolute marvel. It is what linguists formally call a language isolate.
Meaning it doesn't fit into any language family tree.
Right, exactly. It sits completely independent of any major South American language family. It basically has no known linguistic relatives anywhere on the globe. It just evolved entirely on its own.
I have to pause you there because, well, logically, that is really hard to wrap my head around. Well, you have the Inca Empire aggressively expanding down from the north, and then later you have the Spanish colonizers sweeping across the continent. Both of those empires were actively assimilating indigenous cultures. So how does Mapudungun survive as this linguistic island on the western slopes of the Andes without being swallowed up?
Well, part of the answer lies in their phenomenal geographical fortress. The Andes Mountains create a natural bottleneck that made large-scale invasions and supply chains incredibly difficult for outsiders.
Right, that makes sense physically.
But beyond the terrain, it was a profound cultural boundary.
Okay, but cultural boundaries is kind of a nice academic phrase, you know.
Yeah.
Setting a boundary doesn't exactly stop Spanish cavalry or musket fire.
Yeah.
How did they practically ensure this language survived?
They survived practically because they refused to adopt the administrative languages of their invaders for their internal network.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, while they might trade or negotiate with outsiders in another language, they strictly maintain Mapudungun as the exclusive vehicle for their internal laws, their familial histories, and their spirituality.
So to speak the language was to be part of the mesh network.
Precisely. If you lose the language, you lose the network.
So how does that highly protected language actually function on a mechanical level? Let's turn to the slide titled, The Architecture of Mapudungun. The text notes that its grammatical framework completely differs from colonial languages like Spanish.
Oh, it is a radical departure. To start, it relies on an SOV syntactic order, which stands for subject, object, verb.
Okay, so if you wanted to say, I see the mountain, the structural order of the thought would actually be, I the mountain see.
Exactly. But the true complexity really lies in how the words themselves are built. Mapudungun utilizes an agglutinative morphology.
Agglutinative. Okay, you're going to have to explain that to those of us who aren't linguistics professors. What does an agglutinative language actually look like in practice?
Okay, think about English. We use separate, individual words to convey a complex thought, right? Pronouns, prepositions, verbs, adjectives. Well, in an agglutinative language, you start with a single root word. Then you attach multiple distinct suffixes and particles directly onto that root to add new layers of meaning.
Oh, so it's kind of like playing with Lego bricks.
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy.
You take a base Lego brick, which is the root word, and then you snap a red suffix onto it to indicate time, and then a yellow brick to indicate a relationship, and maybe a green brick for emotion. So instead of a long sentence of separate words, you just stack all these ideas into one massive, highly complex word.
That is a perfect way to grasp it. The slide actually compares it to weaving individual threads into a larger pattern.
Wow.
Yeah, every suffix you snap on changes the nuance. It allows speakers to convey incredibly precise information about their environment without ever breaking the structural continuity of the word itself.
But having a language that complex and nuanced creates, I don't know, a profound vulnerability, right? And for most of its history, Mapudungun didn't actually have an alphabet. Let's look at the slide titled, From Oral Tradition to Written Word.
Right.
If a language lives entirely in the breath of its speakers, what happens when those speakers are threatened?
You face the very real risk of total erasure. Traditionally, Mapudungun was purely oral. Every law, every piece of poetry, every treaty was passed down strictly by voice.
That's a lot of pressure on human memory.
It is. And currently there are roughly 200,000 speakers across Chile and Argentina. But that number is under immense pressure from the sheer dominance of Spanish in public life, the economy, and modern media.
So how are they adapting to keep the language alive today?
By actively writing it down, there are vigorous revitalization movements happening right now within the community.
Using what kind of alphabet?
They are increasingly utilizing a standardized Latin-based orthography, essentially the alphabet we're familiar with, so that Mapudungun can be formally documented, printed in textbooks, and taught in modern schools.
Just think about the psychological shift that requires for a community. I mean, imagine being tasked with capturing centuries of purely spoken heritage.
It's massive.
Right. You have the specific cadence of a story told around a fire, or the exact way an elder emphasizes a suffix, and you have to freeze that into static written letters on a page. You gain permanence, sure, but transitioning from breath to ink has to fundamentally change how the culture interacts with its own history.
It is a massive transition, yeah. But writing it down is a highly pragmatic tool for endurance. It allows the language to infiltrate digital spaces. It's an evolution of the medium, not an erasure of the message.
That makes a lot of sense. So what does this language actually sound like when it is spoken? That brings us to the slide titled, The Sound of the Land.
The vocabulary here gives us a real window into their psychological landscape.
It really does. Let's walk through some of these. The standard universal greeting is, Mari Mari.
Correct. Mari Mari translates to hello or good morning. And if you want to express that something is fun or enjoyable, you use the word ayun.
Ayun. Okay. But the pattern that immediately jumps out at me revolves around the word kum.
Yes. Kum is a foundational concept in their vocabulary.
What does it mean exactly?
It essentially means good or positive, But notice how it permeates all their daily interactions. For thank you, you say, kume tufa.
Kumitufa.
Exactly. For good night, it's kume akwi. And if a meal is absolutely delicious, you simply say, kume.
Oh, so it's everywhere. There's also kisu mapu, which translates to nice to meet you.
Right.
But, instead of just translating these words, let's look at what they reveal. When a single concept for goodness or harmony is structurally embedded in your greetings, your gratitude, and your food, it reveals a society that prioritizes connection.
Absolutely.
You don't get the sense of a militaristic empire bent on conquest at all. You see a people actively seeking balance and harmony in every interaction.
It reveals a culture totally focused on equilibrium. And that pursuit of cosmic balance isn't just spoken, by the way, it is visually documented.
Let's look at how they visualize that on the slide, titled The Wunelfe.
We are shifting from words to symbols here, and this one is pretty striking. It is. The Wunelfe is arguably their most prominent visual symbol. In its form, it is an 8-pointed star or a sun motif.
And what does it represent?
Its meaning carries the weight of their entire cosmology. It represents the morning star, the vastness of the universe, and that concept of ultimate cosmic balance we were just talking about.
It's everywhere in the Linglobe materials, too. It's woven into textiles, painted on ceremonial items, and it sits right at the center of the modern Mapuche flag.
Yeah, it's incredibly central.
But why is cosmic balance so central? I mean, if you're an agrarian society deeply tied to the earth, the cosmos isn't just an abstract philosophy.
Not at all.
The movement of the sun, the arrival of the morning star, the shifting of the seasons, that is literally the difference between a bountiful harvest and your community starving.
Exactly. Their physical survival depended on an intimate, highly accurate reading of nature. The Wunelfe is a constant visual reminder that the community must remain in absolute alignment with those larger natural forces.
But cosmic balance requires active participation, which brings us to their most sacred object. Let's look at the slide titled The Cultron. The universe in a drum. I have to say, calling this an instrument feels wildly inadequate.
Because it serves a much, much higher purpose. The kultron is a sacred ceremonial drum wielded primarily by the Machi.
The Machis are the traditional healers, right?
Yes, the traditional healers and spiritual leaders of the community. But it doesn't just keep a rhythm for a song. It is a literal physical map of the Mapuche worldview.
Wait, how does a drum function as a map?
It's all in the physical anatomy of the object. The circular shape of the drum itself represents the infinite cosmos and the earth.
Okay.
And then the surface of the drumhead is meticulously painted with symbols of the sun, the moon, and the stars, reflecting those dualities of nature we just discussed.
And right across the center of that drumhead, there is a very prominent cross pattern.
Right. That cross divides the world into 4 cardinal directions and 4 distinct spiritual domains.
So it's essentially a portable spiritual compass.
Yes, beautifully put.
It's like a 3D map of the universe that you can physically hold in your hands. And when the Machi plays it, striking that surface, they aren't just making music, right? They are symbolically setting the universe in motion through sound. That is just a brilliant integration of art and spirituality.
It is. It ensures that their most profound beliefs are never just theoretical. They are highly tangible.
That idea of tangible spirituality really extends to everything they make. Let's look at the slide titled Craftsmanship and Symbolism. Mapuche artisans take raw physical materials and turn them into records of their identity.
Let's start with their textiles. Mapuche weavers create incredibly complex geometric patterns.
And they are stunning.
But these are not merely aesthetic choices. They actually
Okay.
function as a visual language. Specific regions and families have completely distinct patterns.
Wait, if textiles are a visual language, does that mean wearing a specific woven poncho or belt is essentially wearing your family's history book?
Precisely. It is a wearable archive. When a Mapuche person wears a specific piece, others in the community can read those geometric structures and instantly know their lineage and where they come from. It reinforces that mesh network of communities we talked about earlier.
The slide also highlights their silver work. There are images of these heavy, elaborate silver ornaments. But the raw material for this jewelry has a fascinating, almost ironic origin.
It really does. Historically, artisans hammered these out of actual Spanish silver coins.
They took colonial money and made jewelry out of it.
They did. These heavy silver pieces, worn proudly during ceremonies, carry immense protective and spiritual symbolism for them.
There is a deep psychological power in that act. I mean, you are taking the literal currency of the empire trying to conquer you, Spanish silver coins, melting them down and forging them into indigenous spiritual armor.
It's incredible.
You are taking the empire's failed attempt to buy your land and wearing it as a trophy of your own endurance.
It is a stunning act of defiance. And that defiance wasn't just artistic, by the way. When they were threatened, they fought back with devastating effectiveness.
Let's look at the historical reality of that conflict on the slide titled The Arauco War, Centuries of Autonomy. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they had already toppled massive centralized empires like the Inca.
Right.
So they fully expected the Mapuche to be a very quick conquest.
But they fundamentally misunderstood who they were fighting. The Mapuche mounted a resistance campaign that lasted for centuries, known as the Arauco War.
Centuries.
Yes, they successfully defended their borders against the Spanish crown, maintaining absolute territorial autonomy throughout the entire colonial period.
Here is where that Wi-Fi mesh network analogy really pays off militarily.
Exactly.
If you are the Spanish army, your entire strategy is based on capturing this central router. You capture the capital city, you execute the king, and the empire surrenders. But the Mapuche didn't have a capital city. Every single local neighborhood was its own self-sufficient defensive unit.
The Spanish were completely unequipped for it. They would burn a settlement or defeat a local leader, assuming they had won the war, only to find that the surrounding communities instantly routed around the damage, formed a new alliance, and struck back from the forests.
There was no single head to cut off the snake.
Exactly. The Spanish just bled resources for hundreds of years. The Mapuche maintained that autonomy until the late 19th century, when the modern states of Chile and Argentina expanded.
But, holding off a global empire for centuries requires an unbreakable level of internal cohesion.
Absolutely. You cannot sustain a decentralized war if the individual nodes don't feel deeply united.
But how do you maintain unity across all those decentralized nodes? That brings us to the slide titled Palin, the cultural game.
Palin is a highly energetic traditional game. Visually, it involves teams on a long field using curved sticks to hit a ball, so it closely resembles modern field hockey.
But knowing this culture, I'm guessing this game isn't just a sport for entertainment.
Far from it. While it certainly built the intense physical endurance required for their survival, Palin served a critical societal function. It was a primary engine for diplomacy.
Really? So it's like using a high-stakes neighborhood sports league to negotiate treaties?
Pretty much, yeah.
If two different Mapuche communities had a land dispute, or if they needed to forge a military alliance against the Spanish, they didn't sit in a stuffy boardroom. They convened a massive game of Palin.
It allowed them to resolve conflicts, share news, and build alliances in a shared cultural space. It profoundly reinforced their collective identity.
That makes total sense.
Even if they lived in different valleys and had no central king, when they gathered to play Palin, they remembered that they spoke the same language, respected the same cosmos, and were ultimately one people.
Which leads us to the culmination of all these elements. Let's look at the final slide, titled The Enduring People of the Earth. Looking back over everything we've explored in the Linglobe materials, we've moved from the incredibly intricate, Lego-like structure of Mapudungun to the spiritual compass of the Kultran drum.
Right, and melting down the currency of empires to wear as jewelry.
Exactly. So how do we synthesize all of this?
Well, the core synthesis of all these sources is that the Mapuche did not simply survive the currents of history, They actively navigated and shaped them.
Absolutely.
They remain deeply tied to their ancestral land today. They aren't a relic to be studied in the past tense. They stand today as a fiercely proud, vibrant pillar of South America's cultural diversity.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? I think it leaves us with a really powerful redefinition of resilience. True endurance, the kind that outlasts global empires, isn't just about defending physical borders with weapons or building giant stone walls.
No, it's not.
It is about actively keeping a worldview alive. It's the daily, persistent choice to weave your history into a textile, to clash sticks in a game of Palin, or to speak a language that simply refuses to fade from the mountainsides. Thank you.
Thank you for watching until the end. We will continue to bring you many more languages from around the world. Please subscribe to our channel. See you next time on the Linglobe channel.